If you think about domestic violence, and even if you've been professionally trained, you probably think about the following scenario. A man who's got some kind of extreme issues with anger and jealousy beats up his wife regularly. Maybe he uses substances, maybe he uses alcohol way too much, and that's the pattern of violence, and she tries to cover it up, and finally it's discovered. Obviously, domestic violence patterns like that are serious and need to be dealt with. But I'm here to tell you that they're also statistically pretty rare compared to the kind of domestic violence pattern you're much more likely to run into if you're a police officer and you get called to domestic calls. In practically any walk of life, the statistical type of domestic violence is very different from that. To run the tapes back a little bit on this, I'd like to tell you how we know this. And we know this through the development of something called the conflict tactics scale. That's a way of getting people to report on domestic violence in their family by answering a simple question. How do you resolve conflict when it happens in your family? Now, the advantage in asking the question this way is it gets around the problem of some people not reporting domestic violence because they don't think of it as a criminal act. So what used to be called crime victim surveys always ran into that filter. They'd ask about crimes and people would go, oh, I haven't been the victim of any crimes. But then when you ask them, well, exactly what has happened between you and your partner, then all kinds of technical crimes, assaults would come out. The conflict tactics scale avoids that problem. So it gives you 16 times as much report of domestic violence. So it's a very valuable instrument to know exactly how much domestic violence goes on in a society at a given time. Now, it's been used a lot since 1975, mostly in North America, but in other countries as well. And if we look at sort of compilations, what are called meta-analytic studies, which are studies that take all of the surveys that have used the conflict tactics scale, puts them all together and allows for things like different sample size in the different surveys. So it comes up with a really best estimate that's based on all the work that's been done. There's a number of really very sort of high-level papers that tell us exactly how much domestic violence goes on and what kinds of domestic violence goes on. First of these is a paper that John Archer, a psychologist in England, published in the year 2000, where he looked at 64 surveys that had been done of general populations asking about how they resolve conflict in their family, and found some very startling results, startling at that time anyway. The results that he found was that women were more likely to be perpetrators of domestic violence, or sometimes called intimate partner violence, than were men. It was not a large difference, but it was a substantial difference nevertheless, and shocking to people who had this preconceived notion that all domestic violence was male perpetrated. That's not what Archer was finding. He also found that women were injured somewhat more than men were, but not a huge amount. It was, in fact, if you use a statistic called the D', which looks at the distribution of injuries for women and distribution of injuries for men, you find that these two distributions almost overlap. Women are just slightly more likely to be injured, 0.05, a 20th of a standard deviation. In other words, not very much, even if you're not statistically oriented. That's a very small amount. And again, that's kind of shocking because we think of women as primary victims, in some cases sole victims of domestic violence. That's not what the data tell us. Now, if we, in fact, to sort of embellish this a little bit more,
Hey everybody, what's up, y'all? Welcome back to the Poor Man's Podcast. Let me go ahead and pull it up and get it nice and big. Today we have a special guest, okay? He has written over 100 papers on this topic, on the topic of intimate partner violence, okay? Also known as domestic violence. He has written 5 or 6 books on the topic. I'm introducing to you guys Dr. Donald Dutton. How's it going, Doc?
just fine.
Good, it's good. I've been watching a lot of your content online. You've written about 5 or 6 books on the topic. But what's very interesting about life is there's so many avenues you can take, and you chose to focus specifically on domestic violence. What led you down the road to really dig into the numbers and the causes of domestic violence?
Well, it depends how far back you want to run it. I mean, I always had an interest in how psychology would impact on criminal justice system policy, on arrests, etc. And so I was kind of working along those lines. I was a social psychologist at the University of British Columbia. And I started to I got an opportunity to do police training to handle what the police call domestic disturbances, which are family fights. And the cops hated handling in those days. They thought social workers should be doing it, et cetera, et cetera. And so I started doing that. And then, to make a long story short, I wound up actually doing a treatment group for men who'd been arrested for domestic violence. And since I was trained as a research psychologist, I got interested in what makes these guys tick. And I started doing research on this group, and then I expanded it to other groups. And then I was hooked. I mean, I think the thing that always hooked me as a psychological question was when somebody did something that was at first glance just inexplicable. Like, how could you beat up somebody you loved?
Right.
How does that happen? So that's what sort of intrigued me at the beginning. And then I started to get into the research. And of course, then the whole thing became politicized. And
Exactly.
Yeah.
But just one of the things in particular that kind of got me into your videos is your information seemed unbiased. In America, when it comes to domestic violence, a lot of people, when it comes to men dealing with domestic violence, a lot of people just look at it as a joke. We have a show called The View where one of the hosts, Sharon Osbourne, literally talked about having a man's penis cut off. It was a story where a man's penis was cut off and thrown in a garbage disposal, and she laughed at it on air. I mean, we have our pop stars like Cardi B saying that she openly stated that she drugged and robbed men and nobody even cares. I mean, you have the Johnny Depp situation. I just wanted you to for the people that's listening, can you clear the air when it comes to gender and domestic violence? Because a lot of people seem to think it's very exclusive to women dealing with this problem, but your data seems to show something else. Can you please just elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, there's two things. One is, what you're hitting on here is really, really important. That is this kind of, it's not just in the U.S. I mean, this perception that men don't feel pain from domestic violence is most prevalent in countries where women have come the furthest and have the most power. So that's the U.S., the U.K., Northern Europe, Canada, all those countries. It's a political view that has a strong component of misandry. And it's so entrenched that you can take a simple act that can't possibly have a sort of gender aspect to it, which is putting a lighted cigarette out on somebody's arm. Okay. Right. It's going to hurt. Whether you're man or woman, it's going to hurt. But if you ask people, would it hurt a man or woman more? They all say it would hurt the woman more. Now, women deal with childbirth. They deal with a lot of pain. Anyway, it's a perception that people have that whatever happens to the man is not important. I mean, I've given case examples to my classes where guys have been dipped in acid and had body parts cut off and horrible stuff, horrible stuff. And these are all true cases. I mean, went through the courts and the court information. So there's this perception that is kind of something we have to deal with in the terms of looking at male victimhood. Then there's the data, the information on who perpetrates domestic violence. Now, the U.S. is a world leader in this respect because there's been 5 excellent victim surveys done in the U.S. Huge samples, representative samples, starting from 1989 and running right up to 2004. And they all say the same thing, that it's 50% of reported domestic violence is bilateral. It's a two-person thing, back and forth, back and forth. 35% of the remainder, the unilateral domestic violence, is female perpetrated. 15% is male perpetrated. But of that 15%, 10% or 2/3 of it is just like a push and a shove or a slap. It's not serious stuff. So that leaves 5% that fits the stereotype of serious male perpetrated domestic violence. 5% of all domestic violence actually fits that stereotype. That's all. 5%. But we deal with it in policy. So that was the only thing happening.
Right. From those statistics, though, so it was actually found that women are more likely to commit domestic violence then.
Yes.
Not by very much, but definitely more likely from what it sounds like.
Quite a bit, 35%
Oh, right.
to 15%. And that's 5 separate studies with large samples, all done independent of each other. And they all find the same thing. So that strengthens it that much more. You got a collective sample here of over 25,000 respondents who answered these surveys. And it's quite a bit to say 35 versus 15%.
Right. Whoa. So when you look at those statistics, do you find anything in particular as far as race or demographic? I mean, social class? It doesn't matter if you're Hispanic, Black, white, Asian, or rich or poor. Or
the biggest demographic predictor of incidents of domestic violence is age.
okay.
Young people do it more than older people who've worked it out. Everything else like race, socioeconomic class, etc., they're not as predominant. You get things like class times race interactions and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, they don't impact on the basic finding that females are more likely perpetrators than males. And that, of course, stands in complete opposition to our policy and our thinking. So, the police are kind of primed to arrest the man.
Right. So do you think that, I wonder if is it two people that are just attracted to each other through some psychological way? You know what I mean? Like for a person that domestic violence is committed against, do they have a internal thing that makes them seek out that kind of person in a relationship more of, or is it just you hit me, so I'm going to hit you? That's why it's usually 50% and usually. Yeah,
people get locked into, sort of a conflict scenario where nobody wants to give an inch and nobody wants to back down. And it escalates. And it escalates to a point sometimes where it gets physical. Now, it's interesting that in Oregon, there's a psychologist by the name of Deborah Capaldi, and she did something called the Oregon Youth Survey, which followed people from age 17 up until their middle 20s in Oregon for a long period of time. And she assessed everything, including mental health, psychological health, and domestic violence use. And what she found is that you would have these couples that would have a sort of level of combat. I mean, they would have these conflicts that would get pretty heated. They'd be yelling and screaming, maybe pushing. But on one particular day, it would get out of hand. It would go above its normal level of conflict. And then the police would get called, and then the police would arrest the man 81% of the time, even though with these couples she'd been following, it was really clear that both the man and woman were equally physically violent.
Right.
And by the way, that's a state that has dual arrest as a possibility.
Okay. So there is just kind of the idea that if the police get called, both people are going to jail for the night.
Well, it has dual arrest capability. I mean, they could do that in Oregon, but what they were doing was arresting the man only, just the man. They weren't arresting the woman.
Do you think that if they were to implement a rule where they were to arrest both people? Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. So they were basically supposed to arrest both people, but they were still just arresting the man.
They could arrest both people. They could.
Okay.
If they had evidence that there'd been if they'd asked the questions, they would have found that out. But typically, it was just sort of, okay, it's a domestic. Yeah, here you're the guy. We're out of here.
Right. Okay. See, because when I'm looking at a lot of what's going on and a lot of European countries, so you got Canada, you got America, you got you get where I'm going. A lot of Western civilizations. It seems as though there is a propaganda. It seems as though there is a goal out there. And a lot of the statistics I read are pushed by people or groups that I have to assume hate men or dislike men to some point, or have an agenda for other people to fear men, for women in particular to fear men. Do you think there is a political agenda to make men look like monsters, basically? Do you think that that's a thing out there?
There's absolutely a political agenda. It's about power, and it's about getting more power for women by any means. And there's been lying going on with domestic violence statistics for at least 35 years, because I've watched
exactly
firsthand for at least 35 years. And governments just look the other way. Doesn't matter what country you're in. I mean, the Violence Against Women Act, don't get me started.
Can you actually, I really do want you to get started, because a lot of us, we're from the ground, so we don't know very much about this topic. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to have you on in particular, because I know you're a specialist in it. Can you please explain to us that what you just spoke about there?
Okay. Well, first of all, just let me say, your point about propaganda was excellent. And if you look at a lot of newspaper reports on domestic violence, you find that there are, in fact, elements of propaganda there. One of the things is to equate a worst case scenario, like a really horrific case against a woman, with domestic violence statistics, which makes it seem like all those cases are as bad as that worst case. And I just got through telling you, maybe 5% are involve severe violence by a man. That 5% of all domestic violence, that's all. So, typically it's not that case. Secondly, you inflate the risk. I mean, one of the cases where this comes up the most is women leaving a relationship who think that their husband's going to stalk and kill them because they're leaving the relationship, based on those few cases where it happens. But it's still a very rare event. Right. But the propaganda would have you say, I've had women call me and say, I'm leaving my husband. Am I in danger? And I say, well, has there been any violence? No. Why do you think you're in danger? Well, I'm leaving a relationship. You know how men are. I'm going, no, tell me how men are.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, I'll have these conversations with girls my age. I'm 25, so I'll have these conversations, and just, you can tell that there's an innate fear, and it's because this idea is being pushed out that, historically speaking, men have dragged women along. You know what I'm saying? Like, we didn't get, my opinion is, we didn't get to an age of iPhones in abundance from men just grabbing power from, we did that by cooperating with each other. But for some reason, there's a agenda to push the idea that we got to this point by men just basically pulling women along, sexually assaulting them and abusing them, and women were uncooperative and unwilling and didn't like the direction that men were taking us as humanity. You know what I mean? So it just seems that it's so malicious. You know what I mean? And it doesn't seem to be helping anybody. It seems to be driving a lot of fear. Do you? Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's not helping anybody when you start manufacturing false statistics, for me, it always comes down to, what do the data say? I was raised as a scientist, so sorry. What do the data say? Let's base our policy on that. Let's base our fears on being realistic. Is there an actual incidence of these things going on, or is it much lower than what we think? People are terrified of sharks. Well, guess what? The chances are no shark's ever going to hurt you in your lifetime.
We and that's a good point. But you talked about, I watched the video and you spoke about women kind of using this, and just the idea that men are just more violent and innately commit domestic violence. That idea and how it's affected men getting custody of their children when it comes to divorce, and that just being used as a tool. Can you please explain that to other people, with maybe some personal experiences that you may have seen or heard of when it comes to that?
Yeah, it's, if you get custody cases, the first thing a woman's lawyer is going to ask her is, well, has he been abusive? Well, and then they'll find one particular incident which they'll try to magnify to make this guy seem like he's going to be dangerous in the future. I did one case in Seattle where they had such a hard time finding anything on this guy. They went back 30 years to a woman he'd insulted in a bar and put her on as a witness. Isn't that this guy was therefore a danger to his kid, even though he'd never been abusive to his kid or even to his wife.
Right.
So, there's a case. It's a weapon in custody cases. And what you actually find is, even if there is a history of violence against a woman, there's only an 8% chance that overlaps towards violence towards a kid. It's not necessarily the case that a wife abuser is going to be a child abuser, but it's a political battle in family court all the time.
So how do you, so how do you feel about your passion, kind of the thing you've devoted your entire life to, being politicized? Like, I know that has to have an effect on how you can go about what you do with this being your profession and you being educated and actually knowing the statistics, how do you feel about your passion pretty much being politicized?
Well, that's a great question, man. I'll tell you. First of all, let me say I'm retired, so that makes it a little easier. Every now and then I get up and start talking about it, and I walk around being pretty pissed off for about at least 3 or 4 days. I see a data set that is really strong that tells us what we should be doing about domestic violence, and it's being completely ignored and replaced by a political view that is wrong-headed and not supported by the data. And yeah, as a scientist, social scientist, I go, that's just wrong, and no wonder we're not getting ahead with this problem.
Right. So how did they suggest, because we spoke about it a little earlier before we got on there, but how did they suggest that you should go about solving the domestic violence problem? And what was your kind of, what was your objection to that?
Well, the first thing is, we have to redefine political domestic violence. It's not a political act. What feminists say is men go around purposefully hitting women to maintain a power structure in society. I'm sorry,
Right.
that's just wrong, and the data don't support that. What it has is a psychological explanation. And until we start looking at that psychological explanation, which has to do with attachment, which has to do with how we regulate emotion, which has to do with some of the internal scripts that we have in our head, until we do those things, we're not going to solve the problem. And it also has a strong couples component. And there's a few people in the U.S. doing some work with this, but that's about it.
And I bet it's going to be very hard for them to do their job considering what's going on between men and women here. And I mean, you don't have to be a doctor to know what, you look up and you see what's happening to Jordan Peterson, and just being completely honest about certain situations, making some people upset about those situations. We're in a very weird climate. For the guys that are out there that are dealing with domestic violence, for men in particular, it's kind of tough, because how we operate is, if there's a man that's violent with you, you can get violent with them. That's we have society, and we say that's acceptable. If a guy is violent to a guy, or if a guy is disrespectful to a guy, that guy is allowed to then take it to the next level. So guys tend to not take it to that point where they know that it could go that way. Do you get what I'm saying? Like, we tend to be more respectable to each other because we understand where it can go. But we don't have that same rule when it comes to women. And obviously, if a man is being hit and this is a girlfriend or a wife or whatever, if he was to hit her back, he's almost guaranteed to spend the night in jail. So what do you suggest young men to do, short term and long term? So short term, I mean by in the situation while it's happening, and long term being, do you continue that relationship? Is it going to happen again? Just kind of what do you suggest that young guys do, or guys in general do?
Well, first of all, absolutely walk away from it. I mean, you simply cannot retaliate for the reasons you said, because they will arrest you. And that's on your record for the rest of your life. So you, walk away from it. B, you have to confront, if your partner's getting that violent, you have to confront her about her own violence. And you got to make a decision for yourself. Can I stay in a relationship that's this risky, where there might be violence directed against me that I can't retaliate against? Is that really worth it?
Right.
You got to answer that question for yourself. Personally, I would never tolerate a relationship like my wife's never hit me. 28 years of marriage, so that's good. But I mean, when I was doing the treatment groups, we would have guys come in and say, yeah, I hit her, but she's violent too. And the conventional thing you were supposed to do in those days was say, oh, you're being in denial about your own violence and blah, blah, blah. But when I started to look at the statistics, it occurred to me a lot of these guys were probably telling the truth, that they didn't come out of bilaterally violent relationships. And basically what we would say to them is, okay, we want you to do this treatment group, because what you're going to learn in here is how to deal with another person who's angry and violent without getting drawn into it yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
So also kind of, how do you think that, do you feel like if you are a person that's been in a violent relationship, as a man, do you think that that's just something, again, do you think that's something that you're naturally attracted to, something that you should avoid? What kind of signs do you see in people before? Is there anything in particular that lets you know this person could be violent, or?
It's not really. It's hard to tell. I mean, look, there's some obvious things. If you get into a relationship with somebody who's got a substance abuse problem, or they had a horrific childhood and they hate their father, all this stuff, and you see that they've got these sort of outbursts of rage and anger. Well, yeah, those are all like pretty obvious red flags. Say, hey, maybe I should get out of here. But sometimes. And there are some people who just act out, and you see it. You should be able to see it coming. Other times you don't see it at the beginning. It's not even there at the beginning, and sometimes it gets triggered by the fact that the person's in an intimate relationship and they don't know how to deal with the emotions that brings out, and it brings out a lot of emotions, including rage and other things. And so it's first time for them, but it's still a problem. So it becomes more how do I cope with this? How do I deal with it now that it's happening? What's the best way to go? And it's easy to say. I mean, I think you got to draw some firm lines, and you got to decide that it's not in your best interest to stay in that relationship. But I'm not the one in the relationship, and I've done enough. I've been a clinical psychologist for battered men and battered women, both, and know how it's just really hard to break these bonds sometimes.
So do you just looking at the different types there are many types, right? So we're looking at there's verbal. Do you deal with verbal? What would that be? Verbal abuse and financial abuse as well? Because how do you feel? Is it a type of? Can this be seen as a type of abuse if a woman lies about a man being the father of a child?
Oh, absolutely. Abuse. Absolutely, that's abuse. I mean, lying about something that important in someone's life. I mean, their biological connection to a child. That's absolutely abusive.
Right. So do you? Okay. So what would that be? Just financial abuse, or what would that be categorized?
Emotional abuse of a major sort, because you're forming a connection with this child, and part of that might be based on you think it's your biological child. Now, part of it is you're going to get into a father-son relationship or father-daughter relationship with them anyway, but there's still that belief in the biological connection, and you're going to yank that away, or it's going to be yanked away by someone else at a later point in life. That's a pretty heavy deal to lay on somebody. It's definitely emotional abuse.
Right. Okay. Okay. Dealing with just the court system in America. And I know you've done some stuff in terms of just working as an expert, right? You've come in and as a expert witness, right?
Right.
Have you seen any cases in particular where you just found that it was obvious that the propaganda is working, men are seen as more violent, and it just went completely biased in favor towards a woman? Are there any cases in particular that stick out, or any cases of domestic violence that you've read of or heard about or experienced or spoke to somebody who went through it that you could just kind of point out?
Well, yeah, I mean, most of the time was family court issues with the gender stereotypes about men. There's a case in New York, and there's a case in Montreal. I mean, I've done a lot of cases like that. Most of the cases I wound up doing were murder cases that were domestic murder cases, and everywhere, like L.A. I mean, practically, I think 24 U.S. states or whatever. 25 years I did that, and there were clearly psychological issues that were going on, and I was there to speak to those. And so to a certain extent, I was able to cut through gender stereotyping. And I always made it a point to do that. I mean, people don't know, there was a huge study done of spousal homicides in Chicago 20 years ago. And the group that was most at risk for being a victim of spousal homicide was African-American males.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because there's this idea, because a lot of people I speak to, as you know, majority of my channel is African American men. Yeah. And the kind of counter arguments to men as a whole, and like you said, that agenda, okay, that certain group pushing that certain agenda that we all know. I see that a lot, that being the narrative, that being that this man in particular, African American men in particular, are overly violent and we abuse women. That's why earlier on I asked, is there any correlations when it comes to race? Because I've heard that card being used so much. And when I look at the media, anytime there's domestic violence cases, it's never a woman, because that's not going to make you any money. You want to paint the picture to get the most aggressive looking guy, the guy who society fears the most, so you can make the most money off the fear, is basically what it seems like. So what, just kind of, can you dive into some of the statistics when it comes to race in particular?
Here's the key one to know. It doesn't matter what race you are. There's less than 10% that are committing domestic violence.
Right.
Black or white or Oriental or whatever. It's less. I mean, it's the overwhelming majority of every race are non-violent.
That's
in a domestic situation.
Because it's insane how the propaganda really does kick in. And just recently with the whole COVID thing, I wonder if it is just genuinely people not getting along. You know what I mean? Like how, like people just disliking each other. And maybe when because you're a psychologist, so maybe you could break this down a little bit. When we go off and go to work as men and women do whatever they go out and go to work, that time away from each other gets us to appreciate each other a little more. Because how did COVID affect men and women being together domestically? Because from my understanding and from what the news presented, there seemed to be a huge influx in domestic violence.
Yeah, I've heard that. I haven't actually seen statistics. I think some couples got a lot better. They were together 24/7, and some got a lot worse. And the ones that were a lot worse were the ones that started showing up in the registers, the police registers. Yeah.
So do you think that with this political realm, with what's going on with the politics, do you think that we will ever get to a place where this conversation is taken and spoken about respectively, and when it comes to men being having to deal with it?
Well, the trends aren't going that way. You never know. I mean, things could turn around. I just don't know. I mean, I've given up political forecasting because I'm too often wrong. But certainly the trends I see are still all along the lines of this sort of Marxist feminist view. Men are the bad guys. Women are beyond reproach. And that's all you need to know about domestic violence. And needless to say, it's hopelessly simplistic and wrong.
Exactly. That and I see that a lot. And I wonder, what is it about political agenda that makes it so predictable? You know what I mean? It just seems so off. Like it's just on script. We can't have difficult conversations because you're not allowed to. If we're completely honest, this conversation that we're having right now, we have 262 people in the chat or listening to us right now. Shout out to y'all. I really appreciate for having y'all come, but we don't ever hear about this from a male's point of view. You know what I'm saying? And it just makes people, and your political opinion makes you so predictable in 2021. I wonder what it is. Have you ever dealt with any walls or glass ceilings when it comes to you trying to go to a certain spot because you're not allowed to have a certain conversation with people?
I remember doing a 3-day workshop in Spain, and people had flown in from all over the Americas to do this thing, and I had a translator beside me, and the whole thing was on all different aspects of domestic violence, and they were with me all the way until I started talking about female violence towards males. And
exactly.
Like I'd lost them. So, I just lost them. So I brought it quickly to an end and got back into telling them what they wanted to hear.
And that's what I'm saying. A lot of the times, because that's where the money is, that's what you kind of have to do. Yeah. It's kind of the go along, get along situation. You know what I mean? If we all just say the same talking points like robots, we'll get to a position where we can all coexist. But that's not how it works, especially when your opinion isn't the real solution to the problem that exists today. So, yeah.
When you're a psychologist, you sort of learn to fall back on the data to tell you what people are all about. And the data don't neatly fit any political agenda. They don't fit this guy's political agenda or that guy's political agenda. They're somewhere in the middle. It's like when you're an expert witness, you go into court, prosecution wants you to see it their way and defense wants you to see it their way. And you're sort of in the middle. And that's
Right.
exactly what it is with the psychological data. But in terms of domestic violence, I told you what it is. It's pretty clearly there. And until we adjust policies to fit what's really going on, we're screwed.
And do you think that women committing domestic violence against men is not exclusively but more prevalent in 2021 just because of those politics, just men not really knowing what to be able to do, men being told since they're 6 years old that women are goddesses and women are, you get where I'm going? Like, do you think that the uptick in domestic violence, or when you look at women committing violence against men, do you think that's political from political views?
Well, there's a psychologist in England, John Archer, who's done a cross-cultural studies of domestic violence, and he looks at the amount of power that women have in various countries. Like they have political power, etc., and they have socioeconomic power, etc. And what he finds is that when women's power goes up, the good news is that violence towards women goes down. The bad news is, as women's political power goes up, violence towards men goes up.
That's good.
So the bottom line is people, when they get power, don't handle it well.
Right. Yeah, because you look at situations like the Stanford experiment, and I'm not going to go too far into that, but it's obvious that it's the amount of power that you have that corrupts people over who has the power. Do you think? Is there any truth towards the narrative that men are more violent? Do you believe that there's any truth to that narrative?
Not outside a relationship, yes. The statistics would say that. Inside a relationship, no. Women are more violent inside a relationship.
And do you think that commitment to that one person is going to be the ultimate factor in if they're violent or not? Do you think that that's how men respond to it?
That's only one amongst many. I mean, there's a lot of things. It's a very sort of complex psychological picture, but it comes down to attachment issues. Some people are really freak out if they feel they're going to be abandoned, and they get violent on that. I mean, I did a lot of murder cases where what precipitated the murder was the guy thought the woman was leaving him, so he killed her. Now, how inexplicable is that? I mean, he wanted to be permanently away, kill her. That's what he did. So, I mean, it's a totally irrational act, but it's because abandonment triggers such an over-the-top emotional response that has rage as one component that it can lend itself to extreme violence. So absolutely those kind of things go on, and they go on in a lesser extent in everyday non-lethal violence where people just get, over the top and with their own feelings, and these feelings, anger, rage, and everything else connects back to how solidly they were attached in their family of origin. Did they grow up in a family that was relatively secure, and with a mother they thought was going to be there, father they thought was going to be there? Those kind of really simple issues do have an impact.
So when you earlier we were talking about just certain cases that you experienced, and one in particular you talked about acid. I'm trying to get to. You said that there was and I'm sorry, I'm not laughing at the fact that it was a man, but that just seems to be such an extreme to me that I can't even fathom that idea. And obviously these people have to be mentally ill to some extent to be able to commit such egregious. What happened when it came to the acid? I mean, how did the acid get involved in the situation?
She dipped the guy in a vat of acid.
Was it
out and dipped him in a vat of acid? They found what was left, which wasn't much. This was in L.A. I'll send it to you.
Do you have any more of these? Any more cases where you can go more into detail about what happened in the cases? Any that stand out in particular?
Yeah, I got a lot. I mean, I've got cases where guys blew up their family in the car, killed their kids. One guy, they caught him driving across the Bay Area Bridge in San Francisco on fire after he blew the car up because he was about to go to jail, and he thought his wife was going to leave him for a drug dealer, and he didn't want his kids falling into his hands. So he poured lighter fluid on her, he said, just to scare her, and he whipped out a cigarette lighter and blew the whole car up. And he survived. The wife died, the kids died, and he was on fire and carjacked another car and drove across the Bay Area Bridge into the Tenderloin in San Francisco.
Christ.
How many do you want?
No, we can keep, let's get one more. Let's get one more. or let's go for this one. Let's go violence. A woman committing violence towards a man for this one.
Here's one where the woman didn't actually. Well, you be the judge. This guy is living with his girlfriend outside in a small town outside of Seattle, and the girlfriend says, my family are evil. They've got to die, and I can't really grow spiritually until my family dies. Now, you don't have to help me kill them, but you can just be moral support. But I'm going to do it. But of course, if you're really a man, you'd help me do it. So he listens to this 24/7 for 2 years. The wife, by the way, previous to wanting her whole family to die, wanted everyone she worked with to die. She had a hit list.
Obviously mentally ill. Right?
Yeah, paranoia. So she pulls it off. She loads a gun and he goes up. They're living on the parents' property out in the rural area. She goes up there for Christmas. He goes up with a gun as well. They kill the parents. They wait for her brother to show up with his family and the 2 kids. They kill all of them. So they've got 6 deaths. And the newspapers, of course, present this whole thing as this evil Svengali guy who wielded this power over this poor, hapless woman. In fact, it was completely the other way around. She was into his brain for years about how her family were evil, and her paranoia was something that she put out on him and got her to believe it and threatened to leave him if he didn't help. And that he couldn't handle because he didn't have the kind of personality that could stand up to being left.
Jesus Christ. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's how I wonder, do you jeez, do you think that just violence in general, when it comes to just people being violent outside of domestic violence, do you think that do you see any patterns when it comes to what men tend to lean towards and what women tend to lean towards? Because if you ask me, it seems like women, because we spoke about this earlier, and we know that guys are more violent, generally speaking, outside of relationships. But do you see women handling their need for violence in a different way? It seems to be a lot more verbal. When I'm looking at a lot of situations when it comes to women, is there anything that supports that? Is that just all hearsay?
No, I mean, women's aggression is more indirect. I mean, what basically the bottom line is everybody uses what works for them. If men are bigger and stronger, then they're going to use that strength is because that's their go-to. Women have got something else going for them, whether it's verbal skill or whatever it is, they'll use whatever they have.
Right. Yeah, this is okay. Because I didn't want to hold you for too long. I know you got a lot of stuff to do. But before I let you go, I really enjoyed having you on. I wanted to know if you have a book in particular that changed the way you've seen life. It could be financial, it could be self-help, it could be anywhere along any lines. Do you have a book in particular that changed the way you've seen life?
One particular book, I'd say Ernest Becker's Denial of Death, because he made me see that there's something that humans have, apart from whatever subdivision of humans you want, that all humans have, which is this sort of fear of death and the things that we do to deny that, and how we rearrange our psychology to deny that. And that really, I think, gave me more of a humanist view of people rather than what's this group versus that group and all the stuff that goes on now, which lends itself to being politicized and gets you further away from the basic human truths.
Right, that we're all just human and we're all doing it. I just got a really good question that just came up, and then I'm gonna close this up. I'm sorry, Dr. Don. But do you see any relation to domestic violence or violence in general with pornography? Are there any correlations between the two? I know from what I've seen in terms of the statistics, a lot of women are into some pretty dark stuff when it comes to their sexual fantasies.
Yeah.
And obviously men just tend to be more sexually deviant, it seems like, from what is portrayed. I'm not sure if that's completely true. Maybe you could clarify that. But are there any correlations between violent pornography and domestic violence or violence in general?
Well, I don't know the statistics on that. I mean, when we did our study on our group, we didn't find anything like it. We didn't even actually find, and we were used to women's reports of violence as a criterion, but they didn't report high enough levels of sexual violence for it to be anything that we could consider. And whether it was connected to pornography, we didn't assess that at the time. I think there have been mixed reviews. On the one hand, you have some people who say, well, if it's got these deep, dark, tendencies, maybe they're going to manifest themselves. And other people who say, no, that's just fantasy, and it ends there. And I think it's not clear yet. I think it's just not clear.
Okay, it's undecided. It's still up in the air. So just to kind of give a whole general, there are women tend to commit more violence, domestic violence.
Yeah.
Men there is no difference between the race or the gender, or not gender, but the race or the social status between men and women in committing this domestic violence.
Yeah.
Most of the domestic violence that is committed, even the small minority, because it is a small minority, is committed by people who have mental issues.
Yeah.
Basically, these are all okay. I've already asked. I'm sorry. I just asked in the group, maybe if you had a couple more minutes, if they have any questions for you in particular. And I was just waiting for those to come through. But let's see. Let's just go through. I'm gonna see if we have any more questions for you, because I got you on here, and this is really interesting to me. I really like that you're a guy that's based in facts and statistics similar to me, but I'm not really seeing any at the moment. So I think. Oh wait. Okay. Let's see. Okay, here's a good one. Are violent crimes categorized by the damage done or intent?
The way to measure domestic violence in the old days was crime. So they used to ask people, have any of these crimes been committed against you? And hardly anybody ever said anything. So then they said, okay, what we're going to do is give people something called the conflict tactic scale. It seems to be really innocuous. You ask people, how do you resolve conflict? And it starts out with, well, we talk about it, we argue, we yell at each other. And then it gets down to we push and shove, or somebody hits somebody else. So it's got a violence measure in there as well. It's not specifically measuring intent. It is measuring an act, a specific action. And a subsequent iteration of that scale also looked at damage done. And they started asking about injuries, etc. Here's one interesting point. That if you look at all the studies of domestic violence that have been done, and you look at injuries, the reports of injuries by women are about 16% is all higher than injuries done to men. There was one study done in Philadelphia in 1999 where they went into an emergency ward in Philadelphia, and they asked the men, was this caused by domestic violence? 13% of them had injuries that were caused by domestic violence. And they stopped the study at midnight because they ran out of time and funding, and the researchers had to go home. So it's not that men don't get hurt by this stuff. They do get hurt by it. And somebody picks up a knife, the other person is going to get hurt. And it's not just size that matters in domestic violence. It's intent and motivation and willingness to hit the other person. A lot of men learn pretty early on not to hit a woman, despite
right. That's what I was going to get to. A lot of men are, if anything, taught to put women on a certain pedestal, to admire women. And I think because I asked a question similar to that, I believe only 5% or it was something low, like it was 3 to 5% of the men that I asked said that they would ever commit violence against a woman, no matter what. You know what I'm saying? Like there's always there's those ideas in terms of, have you guys found any is that about equal, or how have you guys found that? Do you, in terms of men that even believe that they could commit violence towards women?
Well, I mean, the thing is, even when we studied men who were, in court mandated treatment for wife assault, they didn't think it was okay. And a lot of them were surprised that they did it in the first place because they didn't think they could have done it. It's not, I mean, there seems to be this misperception that wife assaulters are sort of psychopaths who think it's okay to do this. Most of the guys we treated, 90% of them or more, didn't think it was okay. They were sort of ashamed that they'd done it. And that's why they tended to minimize what they'd done exactly. And we had to sort of draw it out. But the point was that despite having this belief that it's not okay, their emotions overcame them and they acted in such a way that was not good. And so we had to teach them how to not let that happen again. And that's what we did. That was what therapy was about.
Therapy. That's interesting how you guys try to fix folks that commit domestic violence or have been victims of it. That's really interesting to me. But we have a question by Red Pill Mike. Is it fair to say that women use domestic violence as a method to gain what they perceive as control, and men become violent once they think their level of control is gone?
That's a good question.
That is a really good question.
We did actually publish a study about 3 years ago that asked people what their motives were in domestic violence, and this idea that women do it to gain control. Women said that they used it to either because they had wanted to get their partner's attention, or they were angry over something he'd said, and it was all a kind of it was a control issue. And I think with the men, there is some point to that this sense of a lack of control, and I'll get it back by being violent. I'll get the control back. So there's definitely a control issue that goes on.
Okay. That was a great question. That was a good question. Let's see. What laws are currently on the table to potentially protect men against any type of violence? Any significant examples where men have won in a case where violence was committed against in the courts?
Oh, well, I don't know if some man somewhere. I mean, on a rare occasion, women are convicted. I mean, there was a professor at the University of Michigan found that, for serious domestic violence calls, the penalties against men are something like 67% higher than they are for women. So women do get convicted. I mean, there are dual arrest states, and it is possible for women to get arrested and convicted in those states and go to treatment. And I think that's a step in the right direction. I mean, I think eventually, if they're back in the same couple, then you got to start dealing with the violence at a couple level as well. But that's for the future.
Are there a bunch? Because this is a question for me personally. Do you ever have examples where, or have you dealt with any examples of heard of any examples where a woman falsely accused a man of domestic violence? Oh, as in maybe hit herself or?
Yeah, I mean, I did a case in Seattle where a guy had this wife who kept pushing him to build their house bigger and bigger and bigger. So he finally hires this guy who's doing this huge construction project on the house. The wife, as it turns out, is having an affair with this guy and wants her husband gone. So she calls the police and says, "My husband hit me." And in Washington State, that's all the woman has to say. You have to leave the premises, pack a bag, you're gone to a hotel for the night. You're now leaving your kids with what was your wife and the guy that she's having sex with. Isn't that nice?
And this is the reason why I have a channel like this. A lot of people in general don't understand what guys generally have to go through as always being seen as the violent person in any situation ever when it's dealing with a woman. And it seems to be women are the most powerful through their vulnerability. But it seems like recently a lot of women have learned to use that vulnerability. You know what I mean? Because we just go, as society, we just kind of brush a lot of situations off because it's a woman and we're like, well, she can't hurt a fly, this and that. But from the cases that you're explaining, I mean, that has to be there. And is there any places that men can go for help? I know in Canada, and you can speak about this a little bit, what you guys have been trying to do up there in terms of getting some shelters. You could talk to the people about that. But are there any places that men can go to get this kind of help if they're dealing with something like this?
There are a few shelters. There's, there's one in LA and there's another one in the Northeast. I mean, I can't remember exactly how to do it. And there's a professor, Denise Hines, who's in the US, who's doing research on abused men, finally. She's doing a series of excellent studies on abused men. One of the things she finds is she did one study with guys that called a domestic helpline because they'd been victimized by domestic violence. 80% of them had serious injuries, and they were all told, "You're the real perpetrator. You're the real offender." This was like 10 years ago. I hope that's going to turn around. There was a lawsuit in California about equal rights protection for men and why men were not allowed to go into shelter houses. That's a really good question. Why are men not getting any shelter? I mean, I know the answer. It's a long political answer. I won't bother with it. But
I mean, if you got the time, we got the time, because a lot of the stuff, a lot of the topics that we touch with, when it comes to men, it always gets politicized. Anytime there's men in an uncomfortable situation and we want to speak about it, for some reason it becomes politicized. So if you want to go into that, you can. I mean, if you want to,
well, I'll try and do it as quickly as possible. I mean, if you go back to the origins of the whole domestic violence movement, I mean, there were earlier domestic violence movements. It was a big issue right around the turn of the 19th to 20th century. Teddy Roosevelt wanted to have whipping post legislation for wife abusers. And it was actually voted on and thumbs down in Canada, Britain, and the U.S., except for 4 U.S. states. And which means, if you're convicted of wife assault, you get the lash. That actually happened in like 3 or 4 U.S. states. So then it sort of faded away, and people thought, okay, it's a social work problem. We'll deal with it through family interaction. And then it came back with a vengeance in the 60s and 70s. And what really sort of fired it up this time was there was a professor at the University of Michigan, Catherine McKinnon, who wrote a book called Towards a Feminist State. And she basically recast gender relations in Marxist terms. Men are the bourgeoisie and women are the proletariat. So, therefore men have all the power, women have none, and they've been screwed forever. And now we have to do something about that. And that's the mindset where the present legislation was formed, with this notion of man bad, woman good. And
immediately, right.
Everywhere. You see it in criminal court, you see it in family court, and you see it with people blanking out when you start talking about female violence. It's unbelievable how heated this political view is. And it came in because, the right-wing politics, they loved it because they thought it was family values. And left-wing politics loved it because they thought it was women's equality and women's rights. And so nobody opposed it. And to this day,
that's insane. We have another question from Good Mother. She said, would domestic violence done by women be reduced if we stop the university feminism, indoctrinated misandry these humanities departments poison our society with?
Short answer, yes.
Because just like you said earlier, with the diminishing or with the increasing power that women have in today's society comes more domestic violence committed by women. And I think we're at this.
It always stuns me that people who are, really sensitive to stereotypes against women don't seem to get stereotypes about men at all. Just don't seem to get it.
They don't care.
Yeah.
Red Pill Mike, another question from Red Pill Mike. Do you perceive female on male domestic violence ever changing, since we now live in a world where men are shamed for expressing their experience?
No, not in the current circumstances. It's not going to change.
Yeah, I think you spoke about that.
Yeah.
Let's see. Mystique said they got a question. Mystique, where you? Okay. Just looking at the news, it seems like women are a lot more violent with weapons in domestic situations versus men. Is this true? Have you found any statistics on the use of weapons in domestic violence?
Yeah, there are stats. Women are more likely to use knives.
I would imagine just because they're smaller, they can, generally speaking, do less damage with their fists or arms or whatever, kicking, whatever. What about in terms of punching versus pushing, or have you noticed any differences in terms of kicking versus pushing versus?
There aren't huge differences. I think, in the specific items on the conflict tactics scale, I don't think there's huge differences. But the use of weapons, women are higher. I think. Double check that.
I mean, it just, if you were to, from the outside looking in, it would make sense that women were a little bit higher on that. Yeah. Let's see if anybody else questioned. If a guy was arrested, if a guy was arrested, police for false domestic violence allegations in Canada, and was acquitted and found innocent in court, and she was found lying, is his police charge record erased?
I'm not a lawyer. I don't know. I mean, it should be, obviously, but I don't know the answer to that.
Right, because you guys are still working on getting shelters up in Canada for men, right?
Absolutely. And the irony is that almost all of my criminal justice court work as an expert witness was done in the U.S., not in Canada, because in the U.S., psychologists and psychiatrists are equivalent, but in Canada, they're not.
Right.
Yeah.
So, with the first, because you guys had, in terms of shelters, though, you guys had 0 up until when? When did you guys get your?
There's one in Toronto right now.
Right. Okay. So guys, if you're in Canada, good news. If you're where Dr. Dutton is, you have to drive 3,000 miles to get help for domestic violence.
Yeah, you're finished. Yeah.
So I think we have a few here, but I mean, there still needs to be a lot of progress. There's a lot of progress to be made. But I think this is good. I really enjoyed having you on. We've hit the hour mark. I don't want to, take up too much of your time. I know you're retired. You're having a good time. You're living life. But I really appreciate you for coming on, Dr. Dutton, and doing this conversation and having this conversation with us. For everybody that donated, did the super chats, I really appreciate you guys. This is how this content is able to thrive, because YouTube tries to demonetize us and do certain things when we have certain conversations. So I really appreciate you guys. I will be releasing clips of Dr. Don on the show, but if you want access to the full show, you'll have to go and become a Patreon. The clips will be very informative. I'll put a lot of the good information in there, but if you guys want the full live stream, if you're not here, again, you'll have to become a Patreon. I'll leave that link in the description. I will also leave a link to Dr. Don's books, okay? Because one in particular that I've actually got, it's on its way still, was Rethinking Domestic Violence. I'm really going to have a good time reading that one. But yeah, again, Dr. Don, I really appreciate having you on. Do you have any just final thoughts that you wanted to share with everybody in terms of closing?
I just want to say they were all really good questions, both from you and from your listeners. And obviously, everybody's thought about this quite a bit. So thank you.
All right, you guys heard it. All right, let's go ahead and head out. I really appreciate you guys for coming to the show. Till next time.
All right.